The story we'll be exploring this morning is recorded in the book of Mark chapter 5 as well as Luke chapter 8. Previously here at Shabbat at the House, some of you will remember, we explored 3 short stories wherein Jesus heals 3 different men. And we said that during this time period, news about Jesus is spreading throughout the whole land of Judea. People are coming in droves to find him, bringing their sick and their disabled for him to heal. Well, we plop down in a similar scene today. Let's begin reading from Mark chapter 5, verse 21, where it says, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake." Jesus has just crossed in a boat over the Sea of Galilee to the other side. And once he lands on that shore, the crowds again find him. Verse 22, "Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded desperately with him, saying, 'My little daughter is dying. Please, come and lay your hands on her so that she will be healed and live.'" Of the many interactions between Jesus and people recorded in the Gospels, this is a rather unusual one. Not because Jairus is asking for help, but because of who Jairus is. He is described as being a synagogue leader. Now, synagogues were found in each of the towns and villages throughout Judea. They were buildings where Jewish people would gather to meet and study God's word and receive spiritual guidance and leadership. They served as a hub of connection, leadership, and authority. And just like a synagogue may be likened to a church today, similarly, a synagogue leader was like a priest or a pastor, only he had more power of influence and a broader authority. This is all to say that Jairus was considered an important man in that town. He had a considerable power and authoritative position as a leader there. But if there's one thing you pick up about Jesus and the religious leaders of his day, is that they are usually in opposition to Jesus. They attack him in public, consider him a blasphemous heretic, and some going as far as to actively plot his death. And so what Jairus does that day may have been shocking to onlookers because, 1, he is the synagogue leader, 2, in this time and culture, a religious leader doesn't bow down to just anyone. The emphasis on external dignity and stoicism was great. Here, he is bowing down and begging Jesus to help him. And 3, Pharisees or synagogue leaders ought to bow down to no one but God. And finally, 4, by Jairus asking Jesus to heal his daughter, he is implying that he believes Jesus can heal her, thus going against the beliefs of his colleagues and superiors. And on top of all this, Jairus is doing it in the full view of all the townsfolk around, in front of the whole crowd. You can believe that news of him bowing to Jesus will get back to his superiors in Jerusalem. But Jairus is experiencing something which can cause all concern about how one looks in public to be thrown out the window. Because if someone you love, like your child, is in danger or dying, what you thought was important in life can be drastically rearranged. Whatever Jairus may have thought of Jesus in the past, he is now willing to do anything to get his daughter help. His actions are clearly showing what his priorities are. Let's continue from verse 24. "So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him." It is reasonable to assume that as Jairus is leading Jesus to his home, the crowd following Jesus slowed his progress considerably. In fact, as we read, the crowd is describing as pressing in on him. Can you imagine on that walk how frustrating this would have been for Jairus? Time is against him, his daughter is dying, and the crowd is slowing Jesus down. Come on, hurry up, Jesus. We must get there in time. Verse 25. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. So here as the crowd is moving along, a woman joins them. She is described as having bled or hemorrhaged for 12 years. She has spent all her money on trying to receive medical care for help, but she's only gotten worse. Now, people don't spend all their money on trying to fix a medical problem which is nothing more than a mild nuisance, so it's safe to conclude that her condition must have been very taxing or painful. And sadly, this is still a situation that many people with long-term illness can relate to today, spending years trying to get help or to heal a physical suffering, but things continue to take a nosedive. And in the end, all of one's money gets sucked into trying to solve the problem. The woman here thinks, if I can just touch Jesus' clothes, I will be healed. She does manage, despite the pressing crowd, to reach out and touch his cloak, which I imagine was not easy if the crowd was, as we read, pressing in on Jesus. But she does manage to touch his cloak, and she is healed. It may be hard to imagine for some who haven't experienced being in pain or being ill for a long period of time, the gut-wrenching relief that woman must have felt at being healed, at being rid of what had caused her so much suffering and what had driven her to bankruptcy, without relief, without hope of getting better. Luke 8, verse 45. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. Yes, thank you, Peter, very astutely observed. It almost sounds like Peter here is saying, Jesus, everyone's touching you. You're in a claustrophobic situation in a crowd, hemmed in on every side, people bustling and jostling you. Of course someone touched you. Verse 46. But Jesus said, Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. In one of the Native American tribes' creation stories, a raven is described as creating man by accident from a pea pod. Now, I've heard sermons and commentary on this text in Mark 5 describe Jesus healing this woman by accident too, as though he is a magic object just passing through town, and something good happens to happen without his knowledge. If you just touch Jesus, even his clothes, you will be healed, or a miracle will take place. The problem with this is that it ends up describing God a bit like a vending machine. Put in the right coin, press the button, and you get a tasty treat. The vending machine doesn't have a brain or knowledge about the universe or a relationship to the people around it. It's just wired to give you what you want at the press of a button. If we are to believe that God is deliberate, intelligent, and that all good things are gifts from him, we must come to a different conclusion than that Jesus accidentally heals this woman and is now wondering who went yoink and got a gift from him. But if Jesus knew the woman was reaching out and chose to heal her, why is he asking who touched him? If you already know who it is, Jesus, why are you asking? Well, this woman didn't just have an illness to deal with, because according to the religious laws of the Jews, a woman who is bleeding is unclean during the time she is bleeding. And when you are deemed ceremonially unclean, you can't go into the temple in Jerusalem. Anyone who touches you or is under the same roof as you will also become unclean. This means that this woman has likely not, or hardly, been touched, been visited at her home, been able to go anywhere, or been able to go to the synagogue or the temple for 12 years. Which means having little to no communication or spiritual support, and also not being able to make the sin offering each year for the forgiveness of her sins. In other words, she has been perpetually unclean, cut off from people, and according to appearances, even from God. Her life has been one of loneliness. She has been ostracized and treated maybe with disgust or at best, sympathetic distance. And that's why what happens next is so significant. Mark 5, verse 33. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your trust has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now we know, and the woman knows, that she's already been healed. So why is Jesus stopping and telling her, "Your trust has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering"? Hasn't that already just happened? Again, we come back to the question, Jesus, why are you asking who touched you if you know who did? Can't the woman just be healed and then go on her way? Why are you making this big public display and calling her forward? Well, if a woman has been bleeding for 12 years and is known for being permanently unclean, and she suddenly comes home and tells her neighbors and all around her, "I'm better now. Let me into your community. Let me into your synagogues, into the temple." How can anyone know that this is true? And this is why what Jesus is doing is so powerful. Because that day, he healed this woman not in one, but in two ways. He healed her physically as she reached out and touched his cloak. And now he is healing her socially by speaking to her. Jesus wasn't asking who touched me because he didn't know who he just healed. Jesus is making seen a person who society would rather not see. He is restoring this woman to a place in her community because he's saying for everyone to hear, "I have healed you, you are free." Usually a person who had been unclean would have to go to the temple in Jerusalem, present themselves to one of the priests there, and then be declared clean. But here, Jesus is doing this for her. Now everyone around has heard this from Jesus' own mouth. News will spread throughout the town. It isn't a secret that only the woman experiences and knows to be true. She doesn't have to prove she's healed to people. She doesn't have to present herself, perhaps experience further humiliation. By allowing her to get close to him, touching his clothes, and stating aloud what both he and the woman knows has happened, Jesus is restoring to this lonely, shunned person a social life and a place of belonging and acceptance in her society. Now, Jesus, during this interaction, has allowed time to pass. He has stopped moving in order to engage with this woman. Imagine how maddeningly impatient Jairus must have felt by now. Not only was the crowd slowing Jesus down, but now Jesus is stopping entirely to deal with something else. You can almost hear Jairus thinking, "Jesus, my problem is more urgent. Can't this wait? Get your priorities straight. Verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" The worst has happened, and in Jairus' mind, it's over. They didn't make it on time. Verse 36. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid. Keep trusting." Verse 38. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. So despite what has happened, Jesus continues to go to Jairus' house, and when they arrive, there is a lot of noise and activity. People are crying and wailing loudly. Now, we in our context may think, well, yeah, of course they're wailing loudly. A child has just died. Why is Jesus telling them not to? If you go attend a funeral in England, the behaviour of those attending will tend to be quite muted, and culturally some tend to mourn in a private manner, behind closed doors, in a subdued and quiet way. But in those days in the Near East, and if you've ever seen in the current day Middle Eastern funeral processions on the news, you'll notice that this culture's act of mourning is a lot grander, more expressive, more outwards, some may say more theatrical or external than we might be used to in parts of the West. And in the days of Jesus, they had something which was called professional mourners. Now, professional mourners would be hired by a family in which someone was close to death, or be hired for funerals. And the job of these mourners was to add to the expression of a loss. So they would loudly moan. Women in this profession would be trained in how to wail as loudly as possible, to make noise and a big deal. And it was not uncommon for a home like Jairus' home to be filled with people if someone is ill. It would have likely been full of neighbours, relatives, just curious townspeople, and of course, these professional mourners. This was a staple part of Jewish culture at the time. And there may be some here today who have, for example, grown up in a traditional Zimbabwean household, where it is too common for the bereaved to have their house constantly populated by relatives or friends for days and days after a death has taken place. Now, with all this in mind, we understand a bit more of what is going on in this scene. As Jesus arrives at the house, the mourners are already busy at their work. They are wailing loudly as a display. And something interesting happens in Mark 5:39, where Jesus says, "Why all this noise and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." And then verse 40 says, "But they laughed at him." That's a bit of a quick mode shift, isn't it? Going from wailing loudly to mockingly laughing at someone. An interesting change of mood. But Jesus is undeterred, end of verse 40. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. Luke says Jesus takes with him the girl's parents, and specifically Peter, James, and John, and everyone else is sent out. And then it says, he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha Koumi," which means "rise, little girl" in Aramaic. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Now, in a previous week, we looked at 3 other stories of Jesus healing people. And we saw how Jesus doesn't just focus on healing people's physical ailments, but on how he treats them in the process. And this week, we find something similar happening here. Let's break down some of the noteworthy points in this story. Number 1, Jesus is willing to come to what may very well be his enemy's house, to heal his enemy's daughter, because as we've said, it is likely Jairus, as a religious leader, was not friendly towards Jesus. And even if he was, it is guaranteed his superiors in Jerusalem would have seen his actions as treacherous, and it might cost him his position and reputation. But Jesus goes with him because he prioritizes helping people. Number 2, on the way to Jairus' house, Jesus is willing to not only heal, but to stop and engage with the woman. He could have done a heal and dash, but he takes the time for care. He understands that with illness can come more than just the illness itself. It comes with loneliness, the loss of connection, perhaps the loss of autonomy, being socially ostracized or being cut off. And so he interacts with the woman and publicly restores to her a belonging in her community and assures her in her relationship with God. Jesus prioritized a holistic healing and the woman's well-being. Number 3, we said that Jairus was probably going out of his mind with impatience at Jesus' delay in getting to his house. We said that Jairus was willing to do anything to save his child, to get her help. But Jesus turns around and calls this other woman daughter. Luke 8:48. This is the only time he calls an individual that in the Gospels. That is, which is recorded. Here Jesus is expressing, Jairus, yes, you have a daughter, and this woman is my daughter too. You will do anything to help yours. I will do whatever I can to help mine. She may seem to be a footnote in your story, someone in the way, on the way to help someone else, but I'm going to take the time to help her. Now, some may have felt that Jairus' need should have been ranked above the woman because of Jairus' position. If he was comparable to a pastor today, some would say, well, I'm going to prioritize the pastor and his family before this random woman on the way. But Jesus prioritizes care over mere urgency, and who needed his help over someone's position. He could have easily said, well, this woman has been sick for years. She can last one more day. But he doesn't do that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if patients received such care when they come to see a doctor or visit the hospital today, not to simply be rushed around or impatiently stitched up, but seen as a person and treated as one as well? Number 4. When Jairus is told that his daughter has died, Jesus tells him he doesn't have to be afraid, but to keep trusting him. Now, this is not a case of Jesus saying to a parent, don't be upset about the loss of your child. That would be preposterously callous. Instead, even though Jesus knows he's going to shortly solve the problem, he is taking the time to assure Jairus that he's still going to help him. He's addressing Jairus' present feelings. So Jesus knows what he's going off to do. He knows that within the hour Jairus will have his daughter back, but he exists with Jairus in that moment of crushing sadness. He assures him, this isn't over, I'm still going to help. And finally, point number 5. When Jesus enters the house, he doesn't just go and wake up the girl. He first makes sure that the environment for her to wake up in isn't frightening or jarring. Now imagine for a moment things from her perspective. From her point of view, she's just felt like she fell asleep. And then waking up to a house filled with the loud noises of professional mourners, wailing, people from the neighborhood, of her mother crying loudly. All that noise and all those people, that can be a lot to handle and scary, even on the best of days, even for adults. So instead, he clears everyone out, making sure familiar faces are there for when she wakes up, her parents. And then finally, when he raises her from the dead, you can only imagine the ecstatic joy which her parents felt and expressed. But again, what does Jesus do? He says, "Give her something to eat." Amidst all the emotion, he doesn't forget his patient. He is prioritizing the girl and her well-being. It would be easy for everyone to be so overjoyed that she is no longer dead, but if she has been ill for a long time, ill enough to die, it is likely she hasn't eaten in a while. And so once again, Jesus prioritizes the holistic needs, the care, the treatment of the person he is healing. He makes sure she feels safe and makes sure she is fed. I sometimes think about some of the televangelists that claim they can heal people. You may have seen clips of this on television or online. Some of these characters draw a great crowd of people wanting to be healed. They come up on stage, there is charismatic music playing, sometimes shouting, confusing babbling. The audience is whipped into an emotional frenzy, and then the person who wishes to be healed is theatrically brought forth and touched. Sometimes the evangelist or healer may strike them or knock them down to the ground, or touches them so they seem to faint and have to be caught as they fall. And I then think about how Jesus healed people. That it wasn't about theater. It wasn't about entertaining the audience or people's perception about the situation or showing off or putting on a show. Jesus focuses on the person being healed. He wasn't just about fixing a problem, but he treated the person in the process, treating them with dignity, with respect, and not just as someone defined by their problem, but a whole person in need of kindness and care. And as we saw on a previous week in the story of the lame, the blind, and the deaf, what we may mistake for theatrical displays or even superstitious rituals is often actually an act of respect and consideration when it comes to Jesus. Because to him, people are the most important, and that they're treated with love and dignity. This is the way Jesus treated two of his daughters that day. And that tells us a lot about Jesus' priorities. And it should also invite us to take a look at our own priorities in how we treat the people around us.